All right, to wrap up some of the new content about experimental design before we move on to some activities, um, I want to mention four different general concepts around experimental design. So, the first of which is something called demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are kind of a weird jargony name for the idea that sometimes features of the study might inform participants about what you're trying to study. So, if you only measure two different things, for example, participants might have an idea that those two things are related. Or in an experimental design, if you are doing something to stress participants out before assessing them on something, then they might infer that that stress is supposed to, in some way, influence their performance. And that awareness of the purpose of the study can sometimes interfere with it. In order to um, somehow try to get around these things, it's useful to use different sort of mechanisms like keeping participants blind to their conditions. So even if you are going to stress them out or something, having them unaware of if there is a no stress condition or a higher stress condition or a lower stress condition, not explaining what the other possibilities are and not emphasizing, one aspect of the study over another. This is single blind, keeping participants blind to the conditions that they're in. Um, it also is useful to think about how receiving any kind of treatment is something that is going to affect people. We know this not only from psychological studies, but even medical research. Receiving what is often referred to as a placebo, fake types of treatments that aren't actually intended to necessarily do anything. Studies like that consistently find that, if you receive a placebo medication or a placebo therapy, oftentimes there are results from those. Just because feeling like you're being treated or expecting that you're being treated is going to result in some changes. And the same type of thing can happen in psychology studies that aren't about treatment, where if participants think that they're being manipulated in some way, they might act differently than they otherwise would. So sometimes it's very useful to not only have an experimental and a control group, but to have some kind of placebo group as well, where participants are, they think they're getting some kind of stimulus or treatment, but it really shouldn't affect them in any way. And then you can see if that placebo group is different from the experimental and the control group. And, depending on your research question, um, then it might uh, be more or less appropriate. I have no SIBO up here just to mention that, sometimes people expect negative side effects from things. Like you might tell people ahead of time when they're taking a new medication that it might cause like headaches or constipation or whatever it happens to be. Not sure why I chose those two, but anyway. And just telling people that they might experience negative things like that can elicit the experience that they actually have them. Either from expectations or just the influence of our psychology and our emotions. So this isn't just for things about improvement like with placebos, but it might be useful to think about it for negative types of effects too. um, when we're trying to study social behavior, it can be really difficult to keep participants in the dark. Like when you're doing a cognitive psychology study and you're just randomly assigning people to make judgments about like dotted lines instead of like solid lines or something. Just first random thing in visual cognition that came to my head. They don't really think too hard probably about the purpose of the study, and even if they did, it might not affect their responses. But when you're doing social psychology, when you're trying to think about people's actual social interactions and how they're behaving, that can be really tricky not to like tip them off about what you are studying. So trying to respect people's autonomy as participants while still kind of trying to hide the exact purpose of what you're doing can sometimes be a kind of fine line to walk. One way that might be useful for all of you to try to obscure the purpose of your study, because you're manipulating a variable and measuring another one, but you don't necessarily want people to connect those two things. So in addition to your dependent variable that you're measuring, you might find it useful to include things called filler items. These are items that either entire scales or items mixed into scales that are unrelated to what you're studying, and things that you believe would be benign or would not affect your outcomes, but obscure the idea behind the study from participants. So, let's say you're looking at whether somebody having time pressure leads to them, endorsing more like racist ideas or something like that. People might connect those two things. So instead of just asking people things about like racialized attitudes, you might just mix in a few questions about that into a longer list of things about different groups and social issues, and then it might be harder for people to uh, pinpoint exactly what you're trying to study. And that's not really deceptive necessarily, especially because you're going to tell them afterwards, hey, we were actually only interested in the things you said about race. So filler items can be really useful, but like there's trade-offs in absolutely every decision you make in a study. The trade-off there is that it will take longer, and participants' attention spans tend to be, kind of short when you're doing an online study for understandable reasons. Kind of related to demand characteristics, but on the other side of the coin, are different kinds of experimenter biases. Sometimes these are called broadly expectancy effects. And just like participants might expect, a particular outcome when something happens to them or when you're relating two things in a study, obviously experimenters are expecting particular things to happen in particular conditions. That's why they've designed those conditions, right? So if you have direct contact with your participants during a study, you might act in ways that tip off participants. Experimenters might be the source of demand characteristics, or they might interpret things in a biased way. Like if an experimenter has to record things about behavior that are in any way subjective, if they know what condition the participant is in, they're expecting to see a particular outcome. So their recording of different things can be biased as well. So if an experimenter knows the condition of participants, they might influence the outcome. And in my social psychology class, I talk about how our expectations, they strongly influence our perceptions of people, and those perceptions that are being reinforced influence how we behave towards people, which elicits behavior from them that further confirms those beliefs, and it's just a vicious cycle. And that's an interesting thing to study on purpose, but you don't want to accidentally have those sorts of behavioral and perceptual confirmation cycles going on, because then it gets in the way of actually studying what you want to study in an objective way. So one unideal way to do this, but a necessary step at least, is to train experimenters and anyone coming into contact with participants to act in a very consistent manner across all the different conditions. This is like the absolute bare minimum you would want to do. Another thing might be if your conditions just require like some different stimuli or instructions, maybe you run the conditions all at the same time with multiple participants, and then you're treating them as a group, and presumably you would have less of a likelihood of treating an individual participant differently. This often is not logistically possible because you need to like be focused on a particular participant to give them the treatment that you need. For our purposes, we don't necessarily need to think about experimenter bias as much here, unless, if you were, let's say, coding people's open-ended responses to your survey, and you knew what condition they were in, then, your bias might creep in there to how you're coding them. But when the responses that you're getting are recorded like numerically from a survey or a computer program, for example, that program is not going to be biased to the participants' responses, right? It just records them, and they don't have contact with an experimenter. So luckily, by using surveys, we give up some realism and we give up some personal connection, but we rule out some possible experimenter bias that might creep in there. An ideal way to do this for in-person studies that is logistically difficult is to use double-blind studies. Now, I mentioned single-blind studies when participants don't know their condition, but double-blind studies are when both the participant and the experimenter are naive or unaware of the condition. This can be hard to do because the experimenter a lot of times is going to recognize what the conditions are, right? So instead of using like the actual primary investigator on a study, oftentimes research assistants will be used that will not know necessarily as much about the study or not be able to recognize the different conditions, and then they don't know what sorts of behaviors to expect from the participants. So they're not presumably giving them any cues or interpreting anything in a biased way. But again, this requires more people, it requires more time, it requires different types of training, and it can only be used in certain kinds of studies. So double blind is probably the best way to do this, but it just doesn't necessarily work all the time. And it can just be difficult in general. Okay, the last two things I want to talk about, pilot studies and manipulation checks, are kind of related in some ways. They're basically trying to make sure that things are working in your study as you intended and expected. So pilot studies are trial runs that you might do with a smaller number than participants than usual. So if you have never studied something in a research area before, or if you're making up a whole new like research paradigm or experience for participants, then it is probably a good idea to test it out first without using all of your resources. So for example, a collaborator and I ran a study where we wanted people to expect that they were going to have an interaction with somebody else, but they were first going to introduce themselves in like a chat on a computer, and then they were going to do like a task together after that. But we didn't actually want to have them do the task. We were really just interested in how they were going to introduce themselves. So we set it up so we had two of us running the experiment at the same time, and we would like come and talk to each other and pretend and say like, hey, is your participant here? Yeah, mine's here. All right, let's get started. And then we did things with GChat where, we held down the space bar in the other room so it looked like somebody was typing. And we checked in a couple times. So, we went to some great lengths to kind of convince people that there was another participant, but we didn't really know if it would work. So we tried it out first as a pilot study just to see if people believed it. And we found that people, by and large, did buy into it, and it seemed like what we did was working. They didn't have suspicions about that part of it. So we were confident that that was working. So it smoothed out some of the kinks. It helped us fix a few things in our paradigm. So you might be testing things about your manipulations. You might just be testing general things about how the study is going to go. Even if you are pretty confident your study is going to work out, it's good to do a pilot study so you're not, accidentally studying the wrong thing or manipulating the wrong thing, basically. Pilot studies often have a longer debriefing period than a normal study because you're trying to probe the participant to see if there's anything they noticed or anything you could improve on. So it's often going to have a longer, more formalized type of question and answer period with participants to help you improve the study. However, participants don't always recognize the things that we might be interested in, and we know that human beings do some conscious processing and deliberative processing of the stimuli in their environment, but a lot of our processing and a lot of our thinking is more automatic and unintentional, and we might not remember it or recognize it. So it's always a fine line to walk here too, where do I totally trust the things the participant is saying, or do I trust something else about the data that I'm getting from them that indicates that they didn't know? Because you can imagine if you trick somebody into thinking there's another participant, there's some motivation at a baseline level for them to say, oh yeah, I didn't think there was anybody. I saw through that, even if they had no idea. So there's some social desirability stuff that can creep in there too. So it's kind of a tricky process that takes some trial and error of its own. The last thing that I'll mention in this video is something called a manipulation check. Manipulation checks in some ways are a bit of a controversial area in psychological research. Remember that when we are trying to manipulate our independent variables, we have some general construct that we're interested in, but we have to manipulate it in some more objective way that's like kind of divorced from that abstract concept, right? Like if you want to manipulate stress and you give people a like countdown clock in the high stress condition to give them time pressure, that like makes sense as a way to manipulate stress in some ways, but maybe it doesn't work. You don't really know until you try. So manipulation checks are things that you can do uh, to see if your conditions are actually manipulating your independent variable. So if you will try to stress people out, instead of just assuming that your manipulation worked, you might want to ask people after the experience some questions on a stress scale or an anxiety scale, for example, to see if they actually did experience the level of stress or anxiety that you expect. Now, um, you can do this for lots of different things. Is it making people happy or stressed, or is it making them rely on racial attitudes more? Or, it could be anything that you're trying to manipulate. And asking those questions might give you a better idea of whether it's doing it. But again, people don't always have conscious access to the way that their social environment is influencing them, right? So it may be that those types of questions don't always help that much. So you could ask them directly. You could ask them via some kind of indirect question or implicit measure to see if they're, responding in a way that indicates their like associations have been manipulated, but they maybe don't realize that they've been manipulated. But a big, well, I'll finish this and then I'll mention this other part. Um, Manipulation checks can really interfere with your study if it brings too much attention to what you're trying to manipulate. So if you think back to demand characteristics, manipulation checks might be a big demand characteristic for people in some ways. If you're asking them about stress, maybe if they weren't thinking too hard about their stress, then all of a sudden they're thinking about how stressed out they are, or they're thinking about how it didn't stress them out that much. So like maybe I don't need to act nervous or something. So manipulation checks, they allow you that level of control to understand if you manipulated your IV, so they might increase your internal validity, but they're going to reduce your external validity because it's going to make the study less realistic. Like when you're experiencing an emotion, you don't normally have to stop in the middle of experiencing it and answer questions about whether you're experiencing it. So it can really interfere with these processes in a way. It can even affect how the independent variable is affecting people. Because if you're predicting that your independent variable is affecting people in a subtle way, and you ask them about it, well, it's not going to be so subtle anymore. And maybe measuring the effects of explicit stress that people have reflected on is substantively different from measuring and studying the effects of subtle stress, right? So by doing a manipulation check, you might be changing your study. So a compromise that people have frequently is to use manipulation checks in pilot studies to make sure that they're manipulating what they want. And then in the real version of the study, they don't use the manipulation checks because they can be confident from the pilot studies that there is a change that was being made there.